general thrust of this techno-diplomacy idea is that political relationships, norms, identities inevitably have some physical embodiment to them. You know, we tend to think of these things as sort of existing in our minds. We might write about them, speak about them, but political relationships, especially between states, inevitably have some physical embodiment to them, whether that's in the form of trade or transit networks, shared infrastructure, financial flows. And these things sort of existing in a physical world as they do are beholden to physical law. So the second law of thermodynamics, for instance. So if that's the case, then if we want to change a political relationship, like we'd like to do with countries like Iran and North Korea so we can help resolve those nuclear crises, then that's often as much an engineering challenge as it is a matter of political will. Any viable program of reconciliation with these countries needs to have some vision for what that political change would look like physically, so we can take into account things like technological inertia, path dependence, and the basic reality that these physical infrastructures that constitute our political worlds have their own kind of characteristic timescales and cadences to them that may or may not line up with the election cycle. And I think in the case of the Iran nuclear deal, the Obama administration may have found out the hard way when they seemed to think that with a stroke of a pen, they could reverse 35 some odd years of political and economic estrangement between Iran and the West, and that, you know, Western firms would suddenly be rushing into Iran to do business once the sanctions law had changed on paper. Well, now we obviously know that didn't happen. The Iran and North Korean nuclear crises are fundamentally about conflict resolution. With North Korea, we've been in a technical state of war since the 50s with the armistice, and we've been in sort of a de facto state of at least economic warfare with Iran for several decades. And these adversarial relationships have congealed over the years into sort of the flesh of international political economy. And so techno-diplomacy is a framework for how to think about nuclear non-proliferation diplomacy that takes things like intent and reconciliation out of the mentalistic confines of the skull and the linguistic confines of written laws and agreements, and instead looks for them in the physical spaces of technological infrastructure and the day-to-day interactions of human actors. One of the things that immediately jumps out at you when you start to follow US engagement with North Korea and Iran is just how frequently things seem to get hung up on the sequencing. I mean, both sides might agree on an end state and on what concessions they'd both need to make to get there, but they very frequently disagree on the sequencing of those concessions. So whether it's the fuel swap negotiations in 2009 with Iran or the 2019 Hanoi summit with North Korea, things are always kind of breaking down on this issue. And what that suggests is that maybe what is really at stake in these negotiations isn't the combination of carrots that will be exchanged in a bargain, but rather the credibility of the long-term commitments that both sides would be making in that bargain. And this observation has led me to start thinking about the dimension of time and to see it as sort of a crucial hidden element of crisis diplomacy. And so what I'm doing now is I've been tracking how negotiators talk about the future and how in the midst of a crisis they seem to grope around for what physical steps they could take that would kind of inch us toward a more benign political future. The case I'm looking at is the 1994 agreed framework between the United States and North Korea, and in particular, I'm focusing on the civilian reactor project that was at the heart of that agreed framework. So in the early 90s, North Korea had mastered the gas-cooled reactor fuel cycle, and they were on the cusp of being able to produce about 30 bombs worth of weapons-grade plutonium every year if they were to finish constructing their fleet of reactors. So this is obviously of grave concern to US decision makers, leads to what's known as the first North Korean nuclear crisis. But in 1993, the regime proposed that it would dismantle its entire gas-cooled reactor complex in exchange for civilian light water reactors from the West. So this is what leads to the agreed framework, helps resolve that nuclear crisis, and many people believe that it may have even helped prevent a second Korean War. So this is really one of the principal episodes of engagement with North Korea. Now today we tend to look back at the light water reactor project as just another carrot that we were going to use to bribe the regime into renouncing nuclear weapons. But I think that the real function of the light water reactor project was that it offered a way to fundamentally change North Korea's political relationships with the outside world and potentially reduce the regime's perceived need to build nuclear weapons. And this reinterpretation of the agreed framework is leading me to a different appraisal of both the successes and failures of past engagement with North Korea, and I think it might contain the seeds of a fundamentally different approach to nonproliferation diplomacy than the common carrots and sticks paradigm that we're used to thinking under.
My empirical method has required me to ingest a nanocrystalline suspension, a variant of the classic truth serum composition. The induced state has enabled me to access subconscious knowledge of a deductive technique involving mind-body coordination operating hand in hand with the deepest level of intuition. The method is not without side effects, however.
My analysis begins by developing a technical understanding of what it would have physically taken to build and operate large Western reactors north of the DMZ. And then I situate those challenges into the diplomatic context of the nuclear crisis. Then I'm utilizing 2 declassified document sets that are available at the National Security Archive, and these give a lot of insight into what the US negotiators were thinking at the time, as well as some indirect insight into North Korea's thinking. So what were their red lines? What concerns did they raise? And then, of course, I've interviewed a lot of the US diplomats and officials that were working the North Korea issue at the time. So I'm working with a diverse array of data. But I think that this strategy of utilizing a reactor trade to manage the credibility of both sides' political commitments really becomes most clear when we look at the sequence of steps that is laid out in the light water reactor supply agreement. So what they did is they took the most time-irreversible steps toward denuclearization in North Korea, and they spread those out across time. And those are to be synchronized with the most costly and time-irreversible steps in the light water reactor construction process. And what's interesting about this is that none of these steps alone would have rewarded North Korea. I mean, people talk about North Korea taking the carrot and then reneging, but nobody benefits from a half-built reactor. And nobody benefits from a reactor they can't operate. Rather, each pair of these synchronized steps had the potential to function as an exchange of costly signals, indicating both sides' willingness to continue down this path of engagement, and moreover, incrementally shifting the incentive structure in favor of taking the next step. So this is what I call arrow of time diplomacy. What I think is happening here is that negotiators are leveraging time-irreversible physical processes on the ground in North Korea as bargaining chips. They're then arranging those steps into a sequence that, if followed, physically takes us to that different political reality. So at the end of the day, we can say what we will about the credibility of written agreements and commitments. You bolt 2 of these light water reactors to the ground in North Korea, and North Korea's political relationships with the outside world are de facto different. And the distributions of mutual leverage and shared interest are de facto different in ways that would be costly and difficult for all sides to reverse. So there it is, arrow of time, techno-diplomacy. Now, of course, a lot of these steps did not take place before the agreed framework collapsed during the Bush administration. but I want to emphasize that a lot of them did. So about 2/3 of that first reactor were built, and North Korea effectively divested upwards of 98% of its emerging plutonium production complex. And so what I'd like to do is to try to understand the sources of that success, as well as some of the other signals that the US might have been sending at the time that led North Korea to hedge its bets with an enrichment program. Whenever we encounter a sort of elegant, organized structure that seems to come out of a chaotic situation, it's tempting to think that there must have been some conscious designer behind the scenes that is responsible for that structure. There must be some mastermind or intentionality behind it. But we know from the life sciences that highly organized structures can often emerge spontaneously from chaotic situations. That messy, even violent turmoil can often settle into one or another mode of dissipative structure. Now, as I'm plotting these irreversible processes listed in the light water reactor supply agreement, I'm seeing this sort of vertebral, almost anatomical structure to the whole thing. It really kind of leaps out at you once you see it. I'm also starting to see that same structure in other moments of proliferation crisis. So the 2009 fuel swap with Iran, or the JCPOA, both seem to have that same symmetry to them. Moon Jae-in's virtuous circle approach to engaging North Korea is particularly striking this way. One has to wonder, do these actors know what they're doing? Have they plotted these things before? Or does that symmetry come out of the structure of these crises? A sort of strange attractor that these systems eventually tend toward if left uninterrupted. This term, arrow of time, is borrowed from the physicist Arthur Eddington, who used it to describe the time directionality of the physical world and to suggest that physical processes could sort of nudge time itself in a particular direction. So towards some possibilities and away from others. Now the obvious objection, of course, is to say that, these diplomats aren't physicists, and are not speaking in a language of thermodynamics or entropy. So how could they be leveraging time irreversible processes in a diplomatic setting? Well, interestingly enough, when Eddington coined that phrase, he immediately pointed out that the time directionality of the physical world is kind of intimately, innately familiar to human consciousness. moment-by-moment basis. But our bodies and our ideas themselves have that same kind of metabolic constitution to them. And when we teach students about thermodynamics, the examples that we use are utterly familiar. So, breaking an egg, shuffling cards, burning of combustible fuels. I mean, you don't need a PhD in physics to understand that if you want to get rid of your love letters so that no one will be able to read them, then burning them is a pretty reasonable way to do that. So I don't think it should be too surprising that in the midst of a diplomatic crisis, the things that tend to emerge organically as threats, bargaining chips, costly signals, tend to resemble these classic entropy-generating processes.